And greetings to you. Joe Rubenstein here, producer and host of Real-Time 1960s. I want to thank you very much for joining me today for this portal into the past, where I document the 60s in real time with podcasts like this, with our evening news reports with audio clips and commercials of the day, as well as our daily timeline. And that timeline, along with each and every podcast, links to social media, how to reach us directly, it's all there for you on our website, realtime1960s.com. And today, on this second installment of a three-part episode, we continue to work our way up my ranked list of the top 10 films of 1962. On part 1, we covered films 10 through 7, Dr. No, Cape Fear, Lawrence of Arabia, and David and Lisa. In the show notes to this episode, by the way, there's a link to that first installment. And today, we'll cover films 6, 5, and 4. So without further ado, the Best of 62 at the Movies Part 2, right now. And we begin with a film that, for reasons I will enumerate, took forever to produce. Released in July of 62, filming actually began way back in the fall of 1960, based on a 1955 biography by Thomas E. Gaddis about convicted murderer and self-taught ornithologist Robert Stroud, Birdman of Alcatraz. A number of previous adaptations for both small and large screen of Gaddis's book had been thwarted by negative pressure from the U.S. Bureau of Prisons, which was less than enthused about what they saw as the glorification of a murderer. Who was still alive, by the way, when this film was made and released. Stroud would die at the age of 73 the day before JFK was assassinated, having spent the previous 54 years behind bars. We'll get to his story in a minute. But Burt Lancaster, star and co-producer of this film, was a hot item in 1960 after getting rave reviews for his lights-out performance in Elmer Gantry, released that summer. So he was able to secure financing and get the film made, with Columbia Pictures distributing. Now, he was not able to get permission to shoot the film at any actual prisons. So the entire film, including a complex recreation of an entire cell block at Alcatraz, was made on Columbia's back lot. But you wouldn't know it. The set design is fantastic. Now, I seriously doubt that there's an actor-producer in the history of Hollywood who fired more of his directors than Burt Lancaster. And indeed, the notoriously temperamental actor, who was 47 when Birdman was shot, did fire the film's original British director, Charles Crichton, over creative differences. Now, to be fair, Lancaster was not the only one involved who felt Crichton, who was mostly known for directing comedies, was wrong for this project. So this wasn't as much a case of an actor with power flexing his muscles. The creative differences were real. And it should also be said, this film is every bit as much Lancaster's creation as anyone else's, if not more so. From the financing, to the development, to the writing, to the shooting, even to the editing. He had never been, and would never again be, as personally involved with one of his projects. There was something about Stroud's story that touched him deeply. So Lancaster studied penal law. He read every document he could find on Stroud's various court cases. He was able to get a hold of all of Stroud's letters and read those. And after firing Crichton, he decided to reunite with John Frankenheimer, a young director on the rise who had originally made his reputation in the 1950s in the world of live television. In fact, he directed the original TV version of a film that we'll discuss on our next episode, Days of Wine and Roses, for Playhouse 90. But as I said, Birdman was a reuniting of Lancaster and Frankenheimer. The two men had made The Young Savages the previous year. That's a New York crime drama loosely based on the Cape Man murder case of 1959, a film that marked the big screen debut of Telly Savalas, who also shows up in Birdman. But Frankenheimer was surprised when he got the call from Lancaster, because they had had such a combative relationship on The Young Savages. At one point on that production, Lancaster, a tremendously powerful man physically, picked up the 6'2" Frankenheimer, moved him 10 feet, set him down hard, and said, "The camera goes here." But even so, Frankenheimer, only 30 years old and super ambitious, decided to try again with the actor on Birdman of Alcatraz. But Lancaster, with his obsessive enthusiasm for this project, had early on made the fateful and ultimately costly decision to cover literally every aspect of Stroud's early incarcerated years in this film. So after the initial shoot, he and Frankenheimer ended up with a cut that was 4.5 hours. So when I said up top that this film took forever to produce, that's the primary reason why. They could not fix this problem of excessive length in the editing room. They had to go back to the drawing board and rewrite and reshoot the entire early portion of the film. Now, fortunately, at this precise juncture in the process, Lancaster won Best Actor for Elmer Gantry. And right after that, he was named the #1 box office star in the country by the Motion Picture Exhibitors of America. And these things helped. He was able to get United Artists to pony up the extra money required for the reshoots. But the schedule got very chaotic. Lancaster, right in the middle of the reshoots, had to go to Europe to film his part in Judgment at Nuremberg. And then, by the time they finally reached the editing phase, Frankenheimer had to leave for pre-production on his next film. So Lancaster ended up editing the film himself with the screenwriter Guy Trosper, which took 3 months. But let's pause for a second and briefly cover the true story of the film's subject, Robert Stroud. Born in Seattle in 1890, grandson of a federal judge but the son of an abusive alcoholic, Stroud ran away from home at 13, making his way north to Alaska, where he ended up living with and pimping Kitty O'Brien, a drug-addicted prostitute twice his age. So on January 18, 1909, O'Brien was paid only $2 of her $10 fee by a bartender named Charlie Van Dahmer. And when she protested, Van Dahmer beat and robbed her. So Stroud, hearing of this, confronted Van Dahmer, and during the subsequent altercation, knocked him unconscious, shot him to death at point-blank range, and then immediately turned himself in. So, found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 12 years at McNeil Federal Penitentiary in Puget Sound, Stroud soon established himself as one of the more violent prisoners. And after stabbing a fellow convict, not to death, who had snitched on him for stealing food, and then assaulting an orderly who had resisted his increasingly threatening attempts to obtain morphine from the prison hospital, Stroud was transferred to Leavenworth in Kansas, where on March 26, 1916, he stabbed a cafeteria guard named Andrew Turner to death after Turner had reproached him for a minor rule violation that would have prevented a visit from his younger brother, whom Stroud had not seen in 8 years. So after a first-degree murder conviction and a sentence of death by hanging, Stroud's execution, set for April 23, 1920, was halted 8 days before it was to be carried out. His mother had gone on a personal publicity campaign for him, which included an appeal to then-President Wilson's wife. Wilson himself had suffered a stroke the previous fall, which was basically shielded from the public, but he was seriously incapacitated. Now, the catch to this reprieve was a mandate by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer that Stroud spend the remainder of his time behind bars in solitary confinement. So the film covers some of this backstory, but in a slightly sanitized way. For example, it is said by the warden at Leavenworth, as he reviews Stroud's case, that Kitty O'Brien had been a prostitute, but it's not revealed that Stroud had been her pimp. The violence at McNeil is also gone, likely for time purposes. But on the other hand, the murder of the guard at Leavenworth is shown as unwarranted and indefensible. And the guard, while not presented as overly sympathetic, he's not demonized either. But Stroud in the film is presented as a hard-nosed but highly intelligent nonconformist who was completely unwilling to surrender his personal dignity and his independence, to whatever degree independence is possible for a convict, who would rather die than give in to his nemesis, Warden Harvey Shoemaker. A composite character played well, and like the murdered guard, not entirely unsympathetically, although certainly more so, by Carl Malden. Shoemaker is a martinet, but not a sadist. He clearly believes that his approach, which is mandating a kind of predetermined, highly regimented uniformity of behavior and viewpoint on his prisoners, is good, that it will prepare them better for life on the outside should they be released. But the price for that regimentation, in the viewpoint of the filmmakers, is the prisoner's soul. And that's a price that Lancaster is unwilling to pay. So his first bird rescue, which occurs in the middle of a rainstorm in the prison yard, is a baby sparrow that Lancaster picks up and names Runty, with whom he develops a kind of paternal relationship. And as he gradually accumulates more birds, this man, with no formal education, discovers, too late, that he is a kind of scientific genius. He orders every textbook he can find, teaches himself everything there is to know about birds and bird pathology, and eventually, using the most rudimentary tools, discovers treatments for a number of bird ailments, and writes a book about it called Diseases of Canaries, the manuscript of which was smuggled out of Leavenworth and published in 1933. And Stroud later updated and expanded that book into Stroud's Digest on the Diseases of Birds, which, at least then, was regarded as a classic in the field. And Stroud continues, in the film at least, to evolve as a person. These little flying animals and his new calling have brought out a latent humanity in him, which is reflected in his increasingly benign demeanor, as well as a handful of developing relationships. With his primary guard, played well by Neville Brand, his somewhat dim-witted but amusing next-door neighbor, played by Savalas, who was nominated for supporting actor, and ultimately his wife, played by Betty Field. I'll let you discover how and why that marriage happened. Now again, this part of the film, this developing humanity, is probably the least true. Convicts who did time with Stroud said he was a cold-hearted killer through and through. And after being transferred to Alcatraz, he was judged by the psychiatrist there to be a highly intelligent psychopath. And Lancaster's campaign in 1962 to get Stroud released, which included a personal meeting with Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, was unsuccessful. But as I said last time about Lawrence of Arabia, this is a film best appreciated as a semi-fictionalized, perhaps even largely fictionalized story of a man who creates something out of nothing, less than nothing really. Or as Lancaster put it, quote, Stroud took a miserable, unnatural existence and made it a meaningful thing, unquote. And the central asset of this film is certainly the lead performance. Lancaster is nothing short of brilliant. He's an actor who I think never stopped improving, got better and better, well into his senior years. Two late performances I can highly recommend are Atlantic City in 1980 and then Field of Dreams in 1986. And his youthful performances were also often good. But that kind of overpowering hypermasculinity is almost too much in those early films. It seems a little overdetermined, not quite human. But as the vulnerabilities of age started to seep in, like Stroud in the film, Lancaster's humanity seemed to rise to the surface. And there are shadings in some of these scenes that are truly remarkable. And Frankenheimer has the sense and the sensitivity to actors to let these scenes breathe. But as far as the film's message, about an hour in, there's an extended time-lapse scene where you see a nestling bird struggle to emerge from its egg. The birds, by the way, despite the best efforts of an expert trainer flown in from Japan, also delayed production. Frankenheimer said he was nearly driven crazy by the fact that the birds would do just what he wanted while they were loading film, but then freeze up when the cameras were rolling. But I think that scene of the bird emerging from the egg is there to underline the film's central dynamic, this slow emergence of a human being from his own hard shell. Again, the reality of Stroud, I'm sure, quite different. But viewed as a thing unto itself, Birdman of Alcatraz is a film very much worth a look. Moving on to number 5 on our list, John Ford's penultimate film and his last really good one, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, which shares one thematic element with Cape Fear, and that is the inherent limitations of the legal system in dealing with violent criminals. But there's another thematic element in this film, which is really its central theme. You know, it's been said of John Ford that many of his early westerns built up myths about America, and that this film and his last, Cheyenne Autumn of 1964, which is kind of an elegy for the Native Americans who had been abused by the U.S. government, that these last two films sort of dismantled some of those myths. Sergio Leone, who practically single-handedly invented the spaghetti western genre and who was a great admirer of John Ford, thought that Liberty Valance was his best film, calling it, quote, the film where Ford learned about something called pessimism, unquote. I would say skepticism more than pessimism, although there certainly is a pervasive sadness in the film, which examines some of the differences between the reality of this nation's history and how that history is often told. Giving rise to the famous quote from the film, spoken by a reporter no less, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. So there are really two protagonists in this film. The first, Ransom Stoddard, played by Jimmy Stewart, we meet in the opening scene, which seems to take place roughly at the turn of the century. Stoddard is a fairly pompous U.S. senator in his 60s who has traveled from Washington to a little town called Shinbone in an unnamed western state to attend the funeral of protagonist number 2, a poor rancher named Tom Donovan, portrayed in the flashback that makes up the bulk of this film by John Wayne. So a reporter asks the senator why he would travel halfway across the country to attend this funeral of someone no one's ever heard of. And Stewart responds with the story of the film, which takes place 25 years earlier, when Stewart was just a bright, idealistic young lawyer passing through Shinbone on a stagecoach in what was, at this point, unincorporated Western territory. We then see the stagecoach robbed by Liberty Valance, Lee Marvin and his crew, which includes Strother Martin, most famous as the chain gang warden in Cool Hand Luke, an actor unsurpassed at playing nasty little weasels. But after Stewart protests this robbery, he is brutally beaten with a bullwhip by Lee Marvin, whose character, Liberty Valance, symbolizes the violence and the chaos of this unsettled West. So Tom Donovan, the Wayne character, discovers Stewart half dead and brings him to Shinbone, where a conflict between these two men quickly emerges. Two conflicts, really. The first is that Stewart believes the power of the law can stop men like Valance, while Wayne is partial to the power of the gun. The second conflict is the fact that Stewart falls in love with Wayne's girlfriend Hallie, played by Vera Miles, who we've already seen in the opening of the film as the senator's aged wife. So we already know that that battle was won by Stewart. But it's a qualified victory, as it's heavily implied throughout the film that her feelings for Wayne were always deeper. So Stewart, once he's healed, sets about civilizing Shinbone. He teaches the citizens to read, he gives lessons in civics, and he and a few others, including Wayne, and a newspaper editor played by Edmund O'Brien, who, by the way, plays Thomas E. Gaddis, Robert Stroud's biographer, in Birdman. O'Brien also narrates that film. Here, unfortunately, he plays an alcoholic, which gives him an excuse to wildly overact and try to be funny about it in the manner of the day. This is a common failing of that era in the portrayal of alcoholics. But he, Stewart, and Wayne work toward establishing statehood, which will theoretically bring with it legal protection from the cattle barons and from hired killers like Valance, who keeps showing up in Shinbone and just mercilessly bullying poor Jimmy Stewart, finally goading him into a gun duel, which seems like a suicide mission for Stewart, not his comfort zone. But despite being easily disarmed by Valance at the start of the duel, Stewart picks up the weapon that Valance has just shot out of his hand, squeezes off a single shot in the general direction of his adversary, who miraculously falls dead, making Stewart an instant, if somewhat bewildered, hero, and ultimately cementing his personal legend and sending him on the road to glory in the U.S. Senate. Now, in case you haven't seen this film, I will not reveal the twist, nor will I reveal the final devastating line of the film spoken to Stewart on the train back to Washington. His facial reaction to that line is outstanding. But this is definitely a picture with something to say. Now, it takes about 20 minutes too long to say it, in my opinion. And there are some typical John Fordisms that I personally find almost unbearable. Most egregious are his attempts at humor. I mentioned O'Brien hamming it up. Also Andy Devine, an inexplicably beloved member of Ford's stock company, who in this film plays the corpulent, cowardly, stuttering town marshal Link Appleyard, who is about as funny as a stroke. But Wayne and Stewart are good as usual. Stewart's a little too old for the flashback scenes, but it doesn't really matter. And Lee Marvin, the Merchant of Menace, is just a bloody marvel. Nobody destroys a room like Lee Marvin. He's a human cyclone in this picture. And different actors develop their own tricks of stealing scenes or moments. Wayne, for example, early in his career, established his own distinctive approach of pausing at odd times in the middle of sentences, just to keep the attention focused on him for that extra second or two. Stewart had his own unique way of kind of stammering his way into his lines. But Lee Marvin took a different approach, at least in Liberty Valance. After observing the somewhat leisurely pace of both the film and the acting styles of the two stars, Marvin decided to deliberately move twice as fast as Wayne and Stewart did, which he was encouraged to do by Ford, who was often hard on actors but who got along well with Marvin. He greatly admired Marvin's World War II heroism in the Pacific. But Marvin just explodes off the screen, and this role would prove critical in boosting him from supporting player to one of the most unlikely late-blooming leading men in the history of Hollywood. He would win the Best Actor Oscar 3 years later for Cat Ballou. Now, Liberty Valance did not get great reviews when it came out. First of all, it was in black and white at a time when color was taking over, especially in westerns. Secondly, it featured none of the wide-open vistas that you see in most of Ford's westerns, the ones shot in Monument Valley. Ford, for reasons I don't entirely comprehend, maybe just professional pride, he always claimed this was his own creative choice for Liberty Valance. But that claim has been contradicted by virtually everyone else associated with the film, who said it was shot on Paramount sound stages for purely budgetary reasons. But the film has certainly grown in reputation, and its skeptical, almost cynical message about American history, especially coming from a patriot like Ford, who had been wounded himself in the Pacific by a machine gun bullet while filming the Japanese attack on Midway, and who also had been present at Omaha Beach on D-Day. So the message, especially coming from Ford, is striking. This notion that many of the more nuanced or downright unpleasant facts of history, how often these are airbrushed or just set aside entirely in favor of legends, just because those legends make us feel good. All right, moving on to our last film for today, an interesting blend of political thriller and black comedy that manages to skewer both the extreme left and the extreme right, based on a 1959 novel by Richard Condon, The Manchurian Candidate, released just 2 days after President Kennedy's televised speech informing the world that the Soviets had offensive missiles in Cuba. The time period for this film, however, is not 1962. It takes place about 10 years earlier, and tells the story of Sergeant Raymond Shaw, played by Lawrence Harvey, a supposed but not actual hero of the Korean War, who is the son of a prominent political family. His stepfather is Senator Johnny Iceland, a barely disguised Joseph McCarthy, played by comedic actor James Gregory. But it's the mother, Eleanor, played fantastically, and considering how tiny she was, pretty frighteningly, by Angela Lansbury. The mother is the power behind the throne, bullying and cajoling her senator husband into doing her bidding. So we learn pretty much immediately through flashback that Sergeant Raymond Shaw, the Harvey character, after having been captured in Korea in 1952, along with the rest of his platoon, including Major Bennett Marco, played by Frank Sinatra, who co-produced this film, this entire platoon was transported to communist China, where Raymond was brainwashed into being an unwitting assassin for a communist conspiracy to take over the U.S., who can be ordered to kill without compunction by the trigger phrase, "Why don't we pass the time by playing a little solitaire?" He's also been trained to immediately forget any murder he commits, so he cannot give himself or the conspiracy away. The rest of the men, meanwhile, have also been brainwashed into telling a fictional story of Raymond's military heroism, and also into praising the cold, unlikable sergeant as, quote, "the kindest, bravest, warmest, most wonderful human being I've ever known in my life," unquote. And you see them, having been released back to the U.S. after the war, you see them robotically repeat this phrase whenever anyone asks them about Raymond. The purpose of this, and even more so, the fake story about Raymond's military heroism, is to win for Raymond the Congressional Medal of Honor, make him a nationally known hero, and in doing so, boost his stepfather's chances at a vice presidential nomination. The next step in their plan I will not reveal. But while Raymond's brainwashing appears to have worked, the rest of the men, not so much. As back in the U.S., they all start having a mostly identical recurring nightmare, essentially filtered memories of an actual brainwashing demonstration back in China 2 years earlier, where the communists, as a kind of final exam, had ordered Raymond to murder 2 of his platoon members, one by strangulation, the other by a bullet in the head, for an appreciative audience of Chinese and Soviet officials, which Raymond does with no hesitation, while the rest of the brainwashed men, including the 2 victims, just sit there passively and make no attempt to stop him. And these flashback nightmares we see are, to me, the major highlight of the film. The platoon members had been trained by their captors to envision this brainwashing demonstration not as a bunch of communists discussing a conspiracy, but as old ladies, members of a garden club, attending a lecture on hydrangeas at a hotel in New Jersey, I guess to make it all seem less threatening. And what's fascinating is we see and hear both versions of the demonstration. In other words, sometimes you're looking at the actual Chinese scientist, the head of the brainwashing effort, who delivers his lecture in front of large portraits of Stalin and Mao, and you see his actual audience of communist officials. But at other times, you see them as the prisoners do, as the harmless little old ladies of the garden club. And to heighten the surreal effect, sometimes the ladies are talking about flowers, but other times you hear what the communists are actually saying, which is often brutal. But it's the little old ladies speaking the words, which creates a fascinating kind of cognitive dissonance. So these flashback nightmare sequences, which are better seen than described, are very effective and took a lot of time to shoot because they had to use multiple teams of actors. Actually, as part of director John Frankenheimer's effort to have us share with these tortured soldiers their perceptions and memories of this horrible demonstration. One prisoner, Corporal Alan Melvin, played by James Edwards, is black. And so in Corporal Melvin's nightmare memories, he sees the little old ladies as black, which was not in the novel, by the way. That was Frankenheimer's contribution. But this meant that the producers had to assemble 3 teams of actors, the Chinese and Soviet communists, the old white ladies, and the old black ladies. But the effect of these scenes is quite startling. Honestly, I can't say I've ever seen anything quite like it in any other Hollywood film, certainly not from that era. Now, there's a major twist, which I will not reveal. I will say the first time I saw this film, which was in college, this twist had my jaw on the floor. I absolutely had not seen it coming, so I don't want to deprive you of that moment if you have not seen The Manchurian Candidate. But one of the things that makes this film interesting is that it deals with the Cold War with a kind of bluntness that's unusual for the era. Even those portraits you see during the brainwashing demonstration of Stalin and Mao are striking. I can't offhand think of another Hollywood film of that era that even mentions either of those two names, especially Mao. I mean, the whole issue of communism was so sensitive and there was so much paranoia surrounding it that it was often avoided or talked around. But again, both sides, the communists and the McCarthyites, come off equally poorly in this film. Frankenheimer, in an interview a few years later, told a funny story about the initial preview of this film, which took place in San Francisco. He was standing in the lobby after the screening, and an audience member walked up, and after establishing that Frankenheimer was the director, this man said, "Great picture, but you do realize that these goddamn commies are never going to let you release it, right? This picture really shows them for what they are." And then about a minute later, another guy walks up and says, "Great picture, but you know those right-wing bastards are never going to let you release it. You hit them too hard." So Frankenheimer, according to this story, which may be apocryphal, then introduced these two gentlemen to each other. And the last he saw of them, they were having a heated argument in the lobby. But true or not, the point of the story holds, which is to the extent that this film has a political agenda, it's anti-totalitarian, and that's something I think we can all agree on, hopefully. The acting is generally very good. Lawrence Harvey manages to shed his British accent for the most part, or at least transform it into a kind of upper-class American accent. And it's a really striking performance by an actor who died way too young of cancer in 1973, but he effectively conveys both this character's cold remoteness as well as his tortured psyche. Lansbury, also British, does even better with her American accent, and as I said, she's just phenomenal. Sinatra, whose performance I would describe as perfectly satisfactory, a great singer, never a great dramatic actor, but this may be his best work in that regard. He had wanted Lucille Ball to play the role of the mother, which could have been interesting. You know, she did play dramatic roles early in her career. And she also, on a personal level, and this may be why Sinatra wanted her, was quite a tough lady. But Frankenheimer won out with Lansbury, with whom he had worked before. And her Oscar-nominated supporting performance, she lost out to Patty Duke for The Miracle Worker. That's the kind of film and performance that the Academy loves. But Lansbury is so good and so chilling that you're happy to suspend disbelief and ignore the fact that she's only 3 years older than Harvey, the man playing her son, with whom, by the way, it is heavily implied in the film she has an incestuous relationship. It's spelled out in the novel, only indicated here with a full-on kiss on the lips, which, as I mentioned last time with Cape Fear, is just another indication that the game was changing around this time as far as what could be depicted, or implied in this case, in Hollywood films. But if you haven't seen it, check out The Manchurian Candidate. Not a work of art, but it doesn't try to be. And it really is Frankenheimer's signature film of the 60s, a bracing and unusual mixture of suspenseful fever dream and black comedy. It's also a frank and fascinating document from one of the most intense periods of the Cold War. Back in a moment. Your feedback is important to us. On Twitter, @Realtime1960s, on our Facebook page, or you can email the program, realtime1960s@gmail.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. And if you'd like to join our family and help us continue to bring you great content, please go to patreon.com/realtime1960s and subscribe. Don't forget to visit us at realtime1960s.com for our timeline, each and every podcast, links to social media, how to reach us directly, everything you need to know about this portal into the past that we are creating. Thanks so much for joining us, and stay tuned for the third and final installment of this 3-part episode covering the top 10 films of 1962. So take care, and I'll see you soon.